What secret can a man carry that is heavier than any winter pack? In the biting cold of December 1944, a young soldier sits in the snow, writing a lie to the one person he loves most. Stay with us, and you will discover how an ordinary man, haunted by his past, found a reason to fight for the future in one of the most famous last stands in American history. His name is Private Jack Miller. He is 22 years old, a mechanic from a small town in Pennsylvania, where the winters were never this cruel. Here, in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, the cold is a living thing. It seeps through his worn-out boots, through his thin jacket, and settles deep in his bones. The snow isn't white anymore. It's a bruised, gray blanket covering the frozen ground, swallowing all sound. Jack hunches over a crumpled piece of paper, his fingers so numb he can barely hold the pencil. He's writing a letter to his little sister, Sarah. "Everything's fine," he writes. "The food is good, and the men are in high spirits. We expect to be home soon." Every word is a betrayal of the truth. The truth is, they are surrounded. The truth is, his last warm meal was a distant memory. The truth is, the only spirits here are the ghosts of the men who have already fallen. He carefully folds the letter, the paper stiff with frost, and tucks it into the inner pocket of his coat, right next to his heart. It will never be sent. It's not a letter for her to read, but a prayer for him to hold on to. But what good is a prayer when you're not sure you deserve to be saved? Around him, the rest of his squad digs deeper into the earth, their breath hanging in the air like smoke. They are the men of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, an elite division now trapped in the quiet little Belgian town of Bastogne. They were rushed here with almost nothing, no winter gear, not enough ammunition, and rations that were meant to last a day, not a siege. They carve foxholes out of the frozen ground, not with the right tools, but with bayonets, helmets, and their bare, bleeding hands. The forest around them is a wall of dark, skeletal trees, and beyond that wall, unseen but always felt, is the enemy. Sometimes at night, when the wind dies down, they can hear them. Faint German voices, echoing through the pines, the sound of an engine, starting and stopping. It's a ghost story told in real time, a constant reminder that they are an island in a hostile sea. The fear isn't in the noise of battle. It's in this terrible, waiting silence. It gives a man too much time to think, too much time to remember. And for Jack, memory is a more dangerous enemy than any soldier in the woods. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see, especially when the worst one lives inside your own mind? For Jack, the snow and the silence of Bastogne are terrifyingly familiar. They pull him back to another forest, just a few weeks before, the Hurtgen forest. It was a place of endless fog, where the trees grew so thick they blotted out the sun, and the ground was a muddy trap. In the Hurtgen, you could be standing 10 feet from your own men and see nothing but a swirling gray mist. The battle there wasn't a noble fight. It was a grinder, a place that chewed up men and swallowed them whole. It was there, in that suffocating fog, that Jack's war truly began. There was a flicker of movement in the mist, a shadow, a shape that his training told him was the enemy. He raised his rifle, aimed and fired. The flash of orange from the muzzle lit up the fog for a split second. But the shape that fell was not wearing a German uniform. It was an American helmet. In the deafening silence that followed, a name was called out. A name from his own company. Jack never saw the soldier's face, but that doesn't matter. He sees it every time he closes his eyes. It was a mistake, an accident born of chaos and fear. But that knowledge doesn't quiet the voice in his head, the one that asks the same question over and over again. How does a man who made a mistake like that ever call himself a good soldier, or even a good man? That is the question that haunts him here, in this new frozen forest. The famous 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, a fact of history we all know. They had been rushed into the Ardennes to plug a hole in the American lines, but the German advance was so fast it simply closed around them. They were cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and medical aid. Many of the men had just finished fighting in Holland and arrived with little more than the uniforms on their backs, completely unprepared for a winter that would see temperatures plummet to 20 degrees below zero. Their situation was desperate in ways that are hard to imagine. A lesser-known detail of their survival speaks to this reality. To keep their weapons from freezing solid, some men would resort to urinating on the mechanisms of their rifles, a last-ditch effort to keep them functional. They tucked frozen bars of rations inside their shirts, hoping their own body heat could thaw them enough to be chewed. It was a primal, raw existence, stripped of everything but the will to see the next sunrise. This brings us to an unresolved question that hangs over this part of history. We know about the physical hardship, but what about the invisible wounds? Many of the soldiers at Bastogne, like Jack, were veterans of the Hurtgen Forest, one of the longest and most costly battles the U.S. Army ever fought. How did that prior trauma affect them? Did arriving at another meat grinder so soon after the last one make them more fragile? Or did their survival in one nightmare ironically give them the strength to endure another? The official records don't tell us. They only tell us what was done, not what was carried in the hearts of the men who did it. And for Private Jack Miller, the weight of what he carried was far colder than any winter wind. That crushing silence, the one that gave Jack Miller too much time to think, was a fragile thing. It was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark river of chaos. And on the third day of the siege, that ice didn't just crack. It shattered. The world tore itself apart with a sound that started as a low whistle in the distance and grew into a monstrous scream. German artillery had found them. The shelling began without warning, a relentless thunder that shook the trees and the very ground beneath their feet. The air became thick with the smell of cordite and splintered pine, and the snow around them erupted in violent black plumes. In his hastily dug foxhole, Jack pressed himself against the frozen earth. He and his friend, Corporal Evans, had lined the bottom with a layer of pine boughs, a small, desperate trick they'd learned to keep the numbing cold of the ground from seeping directly into their bodies. It was a tiny comfort, a reminder of a normal world that no longer existed. Evans, a few years older than Jack, was the steady hand in the squad. He was a farmer from Ohio who saw the world in simple, practical terms. He didn't talk about heroism or glory. He talked about getting the job done and going home. He was the one who had pulled Jack aside after the Hurtgen Forest, saw the hollow look in his eyes, and simply said, "War makes ghosts of us all, kid. Just don't become one before your time." An explosion, closer than the others, threw a wave of dirt and ice into their foxhole. The earth bucked like a living creature. Jack felt a sharp, stinging pain in his cheek, but before he could register it, he heard a different sound beside him. It wasn't a scream of terror, but a low, sharp cry of pure agony. He turned to see Evans curled on his side, his face pale and tight. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the snow-dusted fabric of his trouser leg. The shelling had found him. The bombardment lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 20 minutes. When the screaming in the sky finally stopped, the silence that returned was heavier, more profound than before. It was filled with the low moans of the wounded. Sergeant Davis, a man whose face seemed permanently carved from granite, crawled over to their position. He took one look at Evans, his jaw tightening. "We're pulling back," he ordered, his voice a low rasp. "The line's broken. We're falling back to the inner perimeter. We have to move, now." But Evans couldn't move. Jack knew it. Davis knew it. To move him would take 2 men, slowly, and they would be easy targets. The unspoken truth hung in the air. In a retreat like this, the badly wounded were often left behind. It was a brutal, ugly calculation of war. Jack looked at Davis, then down at his friend, and the memory of that foggy morning in the Hurtgen rushed back, cold and sickening. He had failed a man in the fog. He would not fail another in the snow. "I'll stay with him, Sergeant," Jack said, the words leaving his mouth before he had even fully formed the thought. Davis stared at him, his eyes hard. "That's not an order, Miller. The order is to retreat." "I know," Jack replied, his voice steadier now. "But he can't be moved alone. I'll stay. We'll wait for a medic." They both knew a medic wasn't coming. The aid stations were overwhelmed, and the roads were cut off. This was the grim reality of Bastogne. The Germans had encircled the town so completely that even basic communication became a life-or-death challenge. This is a well-documented part of the siege. Radio batteries died in the intense cold and were irreplaceable. Telephone lines laid by the Signal Corps were constantly being severed by the relentless shelling. Runners sent with messages often disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. This breakdown of communication leads to a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of the battle. In the absence of direct orders, small, isolated pockets of men had to govern themselves. How did they decide when to hold and when to fall back? When a sergeant like Davis gave an order, was it based on a command from higher up or on his own gut instinct, his own assessment of an impossible situation? History records the grand strategies, but for the men on the ground, survival often depended on the snap judgment of the man next to them. It was a leadership born of pure necessity. Sergeant Davis looked from Jack to Evans, a flicker of something, maybe respect, maybe pity, in his eyes. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. "Keep your head down, Miller." Then he was gone, crawling away into the twilight, the rest of the squad melting into the trees behind him. The forest grew quiet again. The sun was setting, painting the bruised sky in shades of orange and purple. The temperature was dropping fast. Jack did what he could for Evans, packing snow against the wound to slow the bleeding, a crude battlefield tourniquet. He tore a strip from his own undershirt to make a bandage. Evans was drifting in and out of consciousness. In a moment of clarity, he looked at Jack, his breath a weak cloud in the frigid air. "You shouldn't have stayed," he whispered. "I had to," Jack said, his voice thick. Evans managed a faint, tired smile. "You don't have to be a hero, Jack." The words landed with a gentle weight. It wasn't an accusation, it was a release. Evans wasn't asking for a grand gesture. He was telling his friend that his life was worth saving, too. As darkness fell, burying them completely, Jack sat beside his friend in the silent, frozen earth. He was no longer part of a squad, no longer just a soldier in a vast army. He was just one man, alone in the dark, keeping a promise to a friend, and perhaps to himself. The night in that foxhole was a descent into a new kind of cold. It was a deep, penetrating freeze that seemed to leach the very warmth from a man's thoughts. Night in the Ardennes was not just an absence of light. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the world. Jack sat pressed against Evans, trying to share what little body heat he had left. The wind picked up, a low, mournful sound that wove through the pine trees like a ghostly choir. Every snap of a frozen branch, every rustle of a snow-laden bough sounded like an approaching footstep. Jack held his M1 Garand close, its steel so cold it felt like it was burning his skin through his gloves. Corporal Evans was quiet now. His breathing was shallow, a faint rhythmic puff of white in the darkness. He would occasionally murmur something Jack couldn't understand, the name of a town in Ohio, perhaps, or a woman's name. Jack felt a profound sense of helplessness. He was a mechanic. He knew how to fix an engine, how to diagnose a faulty transmission. But he didn't know how to fix a man who was slowly breaking down. All he could do was bear witness, to be present, so that Evans would not have to face this long, dark night alone. This vigil was his penance and his purpose. He wasn't just guarding a wounded friend. He was guarding the fragile flame of a life against a universe of cold. Sometime after midnight, a new sound began. It was unnatural, metallic. A voice, amplified by a loudspeaker, echoed through the forest. It was an American voice, smooth and calm, but it was coming from the German lines. "Soldiers of the 101st Airborne," the voice began. "Your situation is hopeless. You are completely surrounded. You have no winter clothing, no food, and no ammunition. Your generals have abandoned you." The voice was calm, reasonable. It spoke of warm food, medical care, and safe passage to a prisoner of war camp. "Surrender now, and you will be treated humanely. Continue this pointless resistance, and you will freeze to death in a forest far from home." This was psychological warfare, a tactic the Germans used frequently on surrounded American units. It was a cruel and clever strategy. They weren't just fighting the bodies of the soldiers, they were attacking their minds. They aimed to plant a seed of doubt, to turn the gnawing fear and despair that every soldier felt into a tool of surrender. Jack listened, the words washing over him. For a fleeting moment, the image of a warm room, a hot meal, was a powerful temptation. It was a vision of paradise in a frozen hell. But then he looked down at Evans, at the dark stain on his uniform, and the temptation vanished, replaced by a cold, quiet anger. The voice from the loudspeaker is a documented historical fact of the siege. For the hungry, freezing men in the foxholes, it was a constant, insidious presence. But here we find a quirky, lesser-known detail of the American response. The soldiers didn't just ignore the broadcasts, they actively mocked them. They would shout insults back into the darkness, turning the enemy's weapon of fear into a source of grim amusement. It was a small act of defiance, a way of saying, "You can surround our bodies, but you cannot break our spirit." It was a uniquely American form of gallows humor, a stubborn refusal to be demoralized. As the night wore on, Evans's breathing grew fainter. In the hour before dawn, that gray, liminal time when the world is at its coldest, it stopped altogether. Jack sat there for a long time, the silence in the foxhole now more absolute than the silence in the forest. He gently pulled a blanket over his friend's face. There was no grand speech, no final words of wisdom, just a quiet fading, like a candle flame guttering out in the wind. Jack didn't feel grief, not yet. He just felt empty, hollowed out. He had stayed, he had kept his promise, but it had not been enough. When the first weak light of dawn filtered through the trees, Sergeant Davis returned, crawling cautiously back to the position. He peered into the foxhole and saw Jack sitting alone. Davis didn't need to ask what had happened. He simply placed a hand on Jack's shoulder for a moment. "We have to go, son," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. As Jack numbly gathered his rifle, a commotion could be heard from the American lines. A small group of German officers, carrying a white flag of truce, was approaching their command post. They carried a formal written demand for the surrender of the American forces at Bastogne. The note was delivered to the acting commander of the 101st, General Anthony McAuliffe. This moment is one of the most famous in American military history. McAuliffe, awakened from a brief nap, read the lengthy German demand and, according to those present, initially scoffed, thinking it was a joke. When his staff told him a formal reply was needed, he was at a loss for what to say. After a moment's thought, he settled on a single, quintessentially American word. His official, typed reply to the German commander read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." When the German officers who received the note didn't understand its meaning, they had to have it explained to them. It means go to hell. This famous reply, nuts, became the rallying cry for the entire siege. It perfectly encapsulated the stubborn, defiant spirit of the surrounded men. But this leads to an unresolved historical question. Did the men in the foxholes like Jack hear about this reply right away? Or did the news trickle down slowly, distorted by rumor and the chaos of battle? Did one man's famous defiance actually have an immediate impact on the morale of the soldier on the front line, or is its importance a legend we've built in hindsight? For Jack Miller, sitting in a foxhole beside his fallen friend, the grand gestures of generals felt a world away. He was fighting a different war, a quieter war, measured not in territory gained, but in promises kept in the dark. Rejoining what was left of his squad was like returning to a family gathering after a death. The men were hollow-eyed and grim. They didn't ask Jack what had happened to Evans. They saw the answer in his face. They just made room for him in a new foxhole on the inner perimeter, a shallow trench carved into the edge of a snow-covered field. The world had shrunk to this small patch of frozen ground. There was the forest in front of them, the ruined town of Bastogne behind them, and nothing but the enemy in between. The shelling had died down, replaced once again by that unnerving, watchful silence. The date was December 25th. It was Christmas morning. There were no carols, no gifts, no warmth of a family home. The only decorations were the frost-covered pines, standing like silent sentinels. The irony was almost too cruel to bear. On the one day of the year that celebrated peace and goodwill, they were preparing for the exact opposite. Sergeant Davis crawled along the line, his voice a low whisper. "Listen up, they're coming, we know they're coming." Air recon spotted their armor lining up just beyond the trees. He paused, letting the words sink in. "We are low on everything. Food, medicine, and ammunition. Make every single round count." This desperation for supplies is a core part of the Bastogne story. The surrounded 101st Airborne was completely dependent on airdrops for resupply. But for the first week of the siege, the weather was abysmal. A thick, soupy fog covered the entire region, making it impossible for Allied planes to fly. Finally, on December 23rd, the skies cleared and a massive aerial resupply operation began. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes appeared in the sky, a miraculous sight for the men on the ground. They dropped tons of supplies by parachute: food, medical kits, and most importantly, ammunition. It was a lifeline that allowed the defenders to hold on. But here lies a quirky and lesser-known fact of this famous airdrop. Not all the pilots were able to find the designated drop zones, which were marked by colored smoke panels on the ground. A significant number of the parachute bundles drifted off course and landed directly in the German lines. The Americans, with their characteristic dark humor, would joke that they were just being generous, sharing their Christmas presents with the enemy. For the men on Jack's section of the line, however, that resupply might as well have landed on the moon. Their position was too exposed, too close to the enemy to have received any of it. They were on their own. Jack sat in his foxhole, a small canvas bag of ammunition at his feet. He counted his remaining rounds for his M1 Garand. He had 2 clips, 16 bullets in total. 16 chances to stop an enemy he couldn't see. 16 chances to stay alive. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. An entire German assault, thousands of men and dozens of tanks, was poised to roll over them, and his contribution to stopping it was 16 pieces of metal. What difference could one man with 16 bullets possibly make in the face of all that? Sergeant Davis seemed to read their thoughts. "We're not here to win," he said, his voice flat and steady. "We're here to hold. We make them pay for every inch of ground. We fire in shifts. One man fires, then another down the line. Make them think we're a full-strength company, make them hesitate." It was a bluff, a desperate gambit to make their tiny force seem larger than it was. They were no longer an army. They were actors in a play, trying to convince an unseen audience that the stage was full. This tactic of staggered sporadic fire was a real strategy used by outmanned defenders. It was a simple but surprisingly effective way to sow confusion and uncertainty in an attacking force. An enemy, hearing rifle fire from multiple points along a line, would naturally assume a much stronger presence and might delay their advance, waiting for reinforcements or artillery support that might never come. It turned the very act of firing a weapon from a tool of destruction into a tool of deception. For the men in the foxholes, it was their only remaining advantage. As the pale Christmas morning sun struggled to climb over the horizon, a new sound began to build. It was a low, mechanical rumble, the sound of tank engines. It grew louder and louder, a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Then the shelling started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't random. It was a rolling barrage, a moving wall of explosions that crept steadily closer to their position. This was it. The final assault was beginning. Jack felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The waiting, the not knowing, had been the hardest part. Now, at least, the end had a shape and a sound. He chambered a round in his rifle. He thought of his sister, of the unsent letter in his pocket. He thought of Evans and his quiet words, "You don't have to be a hero." What did that mean now in this final moment? Was it heroic to fire all 16 of his bullets and likely fall where he sat? Or was there another kind of courage, one that had nothing to do with fighting at all? The ground trembled beneath him. The forest in front of him began to splinter and explode. The loneliest Christmas of his life was about to become his last. The world dissolved into a storm of sound and fury. The rolling barrage of artillery passed over them, a wave of shrieking steel and roaring fire, and in its wake came the attack. Through the smoke and kicked-up snow, Jack could see them. Gray-green figures, ghosts moving between the trees, their forms indistinct and terrifying. The deep, guttural growl of the tank engines grew louder, closer. The ground vibrated, a constant, bone-jarring tremor. This wasn't a battle of tactics and maneuvers anymore. It was a primal clash of noise and survival. "Hold!" Sergeant Davis's voice cut through the din, strained but steady. "Wait for my signal. Fire on my mark, one at a time." A machine gun opened up from the German line, its fire tearing through the branches, above their heads, showering them with splinters and frozen twigs. Jack pressed himself so low against the earth he felt he might merge with it. He was no longer a mechanic from Pennsylvania. He was just a pair of eyes, staring into chaos, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Now! Riley, now!" Davis yelled. From a foxhole down the line, a single rifle shot cracked through the air. A pause. Then, "Miller, your turn." Jack raised his rifle, his movement stiff and clumsy in the cold. He saw a flicker of movement near a large pine tree. He didn't think. He aimed and fired. The M1 Garand kicked hard against his shoulder. He saw the flicker disappear. He didn't know if he'd hit anyone. In the swirling snow and smoke, it was impossible to tell. He just knew he had 15 bullets left. "Next man." Davis's voice was the only thing holding their thin, fragile line together. Another shot rang out, and so it went, a slow, deliberate rhythm of single shots against a tidal wave of enemy fire. It was a brave and desperate bluff. They were trying to paint a picture for an enemy they could not see. The picture of a strong, well-supplied defensive line, not a handful of freezing, exhausted men on the verge of annihilation. For a few minutes, the strange, surreal strategy seemed to work. The advance seemed to slow, to hesitate. But it couldn't last. A mortar shell landed with a sickening crump just behind their line. When Jack looked, the foxhole where a man named Peterson had been was just a blackened crater in the snow. One by one, the single shots from his fellow soldiers began to fall silent. The line was shrinking. The enemy was getting closer. He could hear their shouts now, sharp, guttural commands in German. Jack reloaded his rifle, his fingers numb and fumbling with the clip. 8 more rounds. He fired again and again, aiming at muzzle flashes, at shadows, at the terrifying sounds that were drawing nearer. Soon, there was no one left to fire but him and Sergeant Davis. The world had narrowed to this single, desperate point in time. Jack ejected his last empty clip. The metallic ping was lost in the noise. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his last bullet. Just one. He looked at it, lying in the palm of his gloved hand. It was small, brassy, and impossibly heavy, the final word in his story. And in that moment, the chaos seemed to fade away. A strange, profound stillness settled over him. What was this one bullet for? Was it for the enemy? To take one more man with him? Or was it for something else? In the darkest corners of a soldier's mind, the last bullet is sometimes reserved not for the enemy, but as a final, desperate escape from a fate worse than death. A way to control the end of the story. The thought was cold and sharp, a sliver of ice in his soul. He thought of the soldier in the Hurtgen fog. He thought of Evans, buried under the snow. He heard his friend's voice, not as a memory, but as a clear, quiet truth in his mind. You don't have to be a hero, Jack. He finally understood what it meant. A hero was not the man who killed the most, or the man who fired until his last breath. A hero was someone who could walk through hell and come out the other side with his own soul still intact. To fire this last bullet, at the enemy or anywhere else, felt like a final surrender to the monster that war wanted him to become. Instead of loading the bullet, he closed his fist around it, its cold metal a solid, real thing in his hand. He kept it. He then raised his empty rifle, took a deep breath, and tapped the steel barrel against the rim of his helmet. Clank. A pause. Clank. It was a small hollow sound, a pathetic mimicry of gunfire. But in the confusion of battle, it might be enough. Clank. Clank. He was continuing the bluff, fighting not with lead, but with sound. He was choosing deception over destruction. He was choosing to preserve whatever small piece of himself was left. This strange act of pretending to fight was a real tactic born of ultimate desperation. Historical accounts from Bastogne mention men with no ammunition left banging metal cups against their helmets to simulate gunfire, hoping to convince the attackers they were still a threat. It's a detail that reveals so much about the human spirit. The refusal to give up, even when all the conventional tools of a soldier are gone. It was a war of the mind, a battle of sheer will. And then, the most unbelievable thing happened. The firing from the German line began to taper off. The roar of the tank engines receded. The rolling wave of the assault seemed to pause, to hesitate, and then to slowly pull back. A haunting, unnatural silence fell over the forest. broken only by the wind and the distant cries of the wounded. Why did they stop? Was it the bluff? Did they believe they were facing a stronger force, or had they simply reached their own breaking point? This is one of the lingering questions of the Christmas Day assault. We know the American defense was tenacious, but we may never know the precise reason the German commanders decided to halt the attack at that crucial moment. For Jack, sitting alone in the snow, the reason didn't matter. The forest was quiet. He was still alive, and in his clenched fist he still held his last bullet. The silence that followed the failed assault was not one of peace. It was a fragile, wounded quiet, filled with the ghosts of the sounds that had just torn it apart. Jack remained in his foxhole, unmoving, as the adrenaline slowly drained from his body, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. He didn't know if the Germans were regrouping, or if that had been their final, desperate push. He only knew that for now, the world was still. The sky was a flat, unforgiving gray. He was alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his friends and the unseen presence of his enemies. He sat through the rest of that surreal Christmas day and into the long, dark night that followed, the single, unfired bullet still held tightly in his hand. Dawn on December 26th arrived slowly, reluctantly. The weak morning light did little to warm the frozen landscape. But with it came a new sound. It was distant at first, a low, deep-throated rumble that was different from the German tank engines. This sound was heavier, more powerful. It was a vibration that Jack felt in his chest before he could properly hear it with his ears. For a moment, his heart seized with dread. Was it another attack? A bigger one? He peered over the edge of his foxhole, his eyes scanning the horizon. The rumbling grew steadily louder, a promise of something coming. And then he saw them. Cresting a snow-covered hill to the southwest were the unmistakable silhouettes of American M4 Sherman tanks. They moved with a confident, unstoppable momentum, their long cannons pointing forward. It was General George Patton's Third Army. They had done the impossible. They had fought their way through miles of entrenched German defenses in the worst winter in decades to break the siege. Salvation had arrived, not as an angel from the sky, but as a column of loud, mud-caked American steel. This is the moment history remembers, the famous relief of Bastogne by Patton's army. After being ordered to change their entire axis of attack, they had covered nearly 150 miles in a matter of days, a stunning feat of logistics and sheer determination. For the trapped men of the 101st, the sight of those tanks was the end of a nightmare. The siege was broken, but history often holds on to fascinating human contradictions. While many of the exhausted defenders were overjoyed, there was also a strange, quirky undercurrent of pride among the men of the 101st Airborne. They were an elite unit, and a common sentiment expressed in the aftermath was, "We never needed saving in the first place." They would joke that they were paratroopers, and paratroopers are supposed to be surrounded. It was a testament to their incredible spirit, a refusal to see themselves as victims. Even in their moment of rescue, their pride as a fighting unit remained fiercely intact. As the first tanks rolled past his position, Jack felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He slowly, stiffly, crawled out of his foxhole. The world felt unreal, dreamlike. He saw other men emerging from the trees, their faces gaunt and smeared with grime, but their eyes shining with a light he hadn't seen in weeks. He saw Sergeant Davis leaning against a tree, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his arm. He was wounded, but he was alive. Davis saw Jack and managed a weak, tired grin. He nodded toward Jack's clenched fist. "Looks like you didn't need it," he said, his voice raspy. Jack opened his hand and looked at the last bullet. This small object had held the weight of his entire world just a day before. It had represented the final choice, the ultimate question. Now it was just a piece of brass. He hadn't needed to fire it. He hadn't needed to surrender his last bit of hope. This brings us to one of the great unresolved questions of the Battle of the Bulge. We know Patton's army broke through on December 26th, but what if they had been just one day later? The defenders of Bastogne were at the absolute end of their rope. They had almost no ammunition left, very little food, and were physically and mentally shattered. Could they have held out for another 24 hours against a renewed German assault? Or was Patton's arrival truly the last possible moment before a total collapse? History tells us what happened, but it can never tell us what almost happened. The line between a legendary victory and a tragic defeat may have been a matter of mere hours. Later that day, amidst the chaotic joy of the relief, Jack found a quiet moment. He sat down, leaning against the wheel of an American supply truck, and pulled out the crumpled, unsent letter from his pocket. He smoothed it out as best he could. He read the lies he had written to his sister, that everything was fine, that the food was good. And then, with a pencil that was barely a stub, he added one final, truthful line at the bottom. "I thought I came here to fight Germans," he wrote, "but I fought myself. And maybe, for once, I won." He folded the letter and put it away. He would keep it, not as a reminder of the war he had survived, but of the victory he had won inside himself. He had faced the end of his world, and in the final moment had chosen not to add to its destruction. He had held on to the last most important thing, the quiet defiance of an ordinary man determined to remain human in the heart of a nightmare. The story of the Battle of the Bulge is often told in grand terms, of generals and armies, of strategies and breakthroughs. But within that epic narrative are countless smaller stories, stories of individual courage, fear, and endurance. The tale of a soldier like Jack Miller reminds us that the most significant battles are often the ones fought in the quiet, desperate chambers of the human heart. His journey through the frozen forests of Bastogne was more than a struggle for physical survival. It was a fight for his own soul. Haunted by a past mistake, pushed to the very brink of his humanity, he discovered a different kind of strength. It wasn't the strength to defeat an enemy, but the strength to refuse to become like him. In choosing to hold on to that last bullet, he made a choice for hope over despair, for preservation over destruction. It's a quiet victory, one that would never be recorded in the official histories or earn him a medal. But it's the kind of victory that allows a person to go home, not just as a soldier who survived a war, but as a man who remembered who he was. And perhaps, in the end, that is the only victory that truly matters.